Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair at 221B Baker Street, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire in the hearth. The dim glow of the room cast shifting shadows against the bookshelves, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and the remnants of tobacco from an earlier pipe. The streets outside lay shrouded in mist, the gas lamps barely penetrating the thick London fog. The hour was late, but Holmes showed no sign of fatigue. His mind was restless, turning over past cases, fragments of unsolved puzzles that lingered at the edge of his consciousness. Dr. John Watson sat opposite him, book in hand, though he had barely turned a page in the last half hour. He studied Holmes with practiced familiarity, recognizing the subtle tension in his frame, the way his sharp eyes flickered toward the door as if expecting a visitor. Holmes lived for the puzzles, for the intricate web of human deceit that only he could unravel. And tonight something was amiss. Then came the knock. It was firm, deliberate, carrying a weight that spoke not of panic, but necessity. Holmes did not move immediately. He had already deduced much about the visitor before Watson even rose to answer. The knock was measured, not frantic. Whoever stood beyond the door was a man of control, someone who rarely had to ask for help. The footfalls outside suggested a tall figure, steady but burdened, carrying the invisible weight of something beyond material troubles. Holmes closed his eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply, catching the faint scent of expensive cigars lingering just beyond the threshold. A man of wealth then, but not the sort accustomed to squandering his fortune on indulgences. A man of discipline. Watson pulled open the door, and the visitor stepped inside. The chill of the night followed him, clinging to the edges of his dark wool coat. His presence filled the room instantly, commanding without effort. He was a man in his late 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a navy three-piece suit beneath the heavy coat. The silver at his temples was streaked through thick, neatly combed hair. His jaw was set, but his eyes betrayed the storm beneath the carefully crafted exterior. He stood still for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in Holmes, Watson, the cluttered but meticulously organized space. Victor Harrington had arrived. Holmes did not greet him, nor did he extend the usual pleasantries. He simply observed, his piercing eyes dissecting the man with every passing second. Victor Harrington was no ordinary visitor. Holmes had read about him in the financial pages, had heard his name spoken in hushed tones among those who controlled England's industries. A steel magnate, a businessman of unwavering ambition, a man whose empire spanned across continents. He was not a man who entertained superstition or weakness. And yet, there was something in the rigid way he held himself, in the slight twitch of his fingers at his sides, that told Holmes everything he needed to know. This was not a business matter. This was personal. Harrington removed his gloves, tucking them into his coat pocket before speaking. His voice, deep and measured, carried the weight of someone unaccustomed to seeking assistance. He explained that his brother, Alastair Harrington, had vanished 3 nights prior. Not from the bustling streets of London, not from a business trip or an ill-planned venture abroad, but from within his own estate. The manor had been locked, the servants accounted for, the security staff reporting. No unusual activity, and yet by morning, Alastair was simply gone. No sign of forced entry, no ransom demand, no trace of a struggle. His bedroom had remained undisturbed, his personal belongings left untouched. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. Holmes listened without interruption, his sharp eyes never leaving Harrington's face. The steel tycoon had chosen his words carefully, revealing only what he deemed necessary. But Holmes had dealt with men like him before, men who believed they could dictate the flow of a conversation, who thought control was theirs to wield in every situation. Holmes allowed him to believe it, for now. Harrington hesitated for the briefest moment before adding what he had undoubtedly debated whether or not to disclose. Alastair had been behaving strangely in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He had spoken in cryptic phrases, had begun avoiding mirrors, had refused to be alone after sunset. He had confided in Victor that he believed he was being followed, not by a man but by something else. Something that did not belong in the world as they knew it. Holmes finally moved, shifting forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, as he studied the man before him. He had no patience for ghosts, for supernatural fears, for irrational paranoia. But he did believe in fear, and Alistair Harrington had been afraid. He asked Victor what he had not yet revealed. Victor exhaled sharply, his shoulders stiffening. For a moment he seemed to weigh his words, as if deciding how much he was willing to admit. Then reluctantly, he told Holmes about the night before.
Alistair disappeared. A servant had heard him speaking in his study, though no one had been with him. When she had approached, she had seen him staring into the large mirror above the fireplace, whispering in low, frantic tones.
She had not heard what he was saying, only that when she entered the room he had turned to her with an expression so full of terror that she had fled without another word. The next morning, he was gone. Holmes let the silence stretch between them, the flickering light from the hearth casting sharp angles against his face. Then he stood. He reached for his coat, slipping it over his shoulders in a single fluid motion. Watson rose as well, though with slightly less urgency, his gaze flickering between Holmes and their visitor. Holmes spoke at last, his voice quiet but certain. He told Victor that this was not a case of disappearance. This was a case of knowing too much. The ride to the Harrington estate was silent, save for the rhythmic clatter of carriage wheels against the damp streets. Holmes sat with his hands clasped, his mind a labyrinth of possibilities. A man had vanished from a locked estate, leaving behind no trace but whispers of an unseen presence. A mind plagued by fear, a brother torn between logic and the impossibility of the unknown. Holmes did not believe in specters or unseen forces lurking in the dark, but he did believe in deception, in carefully crafted illusions, and in the lengths men would go to when confronted with a truth too dangerous to be known. The estate loomed ahead, its towering silhouette outlined against the storm-heavy sky. The windows were dark, save for the faintest glow from the west wing.
Holmes stepped down from the carriage before it had even fully stopped, his sharp gaze already scanning the perimeter.
He noted the unbroken symmetry of the hedges, the undisturbed gravel along the path. No forced entry, no intruders. Whatever had taken Alistair Harrington had not come from the outside. He turned toward the great wooden doors as they swung open, before him the butler standing stiffly at the threshold. The air inside was thick, heavy, carrying the scent of aged books and something else, something subtle but distinct. Holmes stepped forward, his mind already at work, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that had yet to fully reveal itself. Hayu knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not just a case of disappearance. This was a warning. Sherlock Holmes stepped through the towering wooden doors of the Harrington estate, his eyes moving sharply across the dimly lit interior. The vast foyer stretched before him, marble floors polished to a gleam reflecting the light from the ornate chandelier overhead. The silence in the house felt unnatural, a heavy sort of stillness that carried the weight of something unresolved. He did not waste time admiring the grandeur of the space, nor did he acknowledge the nervous butler who stood stiffly by the entrance. His attention was already drawn to the small, almost imperceptible details that others would overlook. The faint scuff marks near the staircase, the slight disturbance in the dust on the side table, the way the curtains had been drawn just an inch too far, as though someone had peered outside recently. Everything in this house was carefully maintained, and yet there were cracks in the perfection. Watson followed closely, his gaze shifting between Holmes and Victor Harrington, who had entered behind them. Victor moved with familiarity through the house, but there was something off in his stride, a tension in his shoulders that had nothing to do with exhaustion. He had grown up within these walls, but now he seemed like a stranger in his own home, as though something about this place had changed in a way he could not articulate. Holmes knew that feeling well. It was the same sensation that came when a presence lingered where it should not, when something that once belonged in a space was suddenly missing. Holmes did not speak. He simply walked, his steps slow but deliberate, leading himself toward the west wing of the house. Victor hesitated before following, watching as Holmes moved as if he had already memorized the blueprint of the estate. The hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow them as they passed. The air grew colder, the wooden floor beneath them creaking softly with each step. Holmes stopped before the study door, the last place Alistair had been seen. He reached out, his fingers pressing lightly against the wood, feeling for disturbances in the grain. Then, without hesitation, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was frozen in time. Papers lay scattered across the grand mahogany desk, books left half open, as if abandoned mid-thought. The chair behind the desk was slightly askew, suggesting movement, but not the kind that came from force. The fireplace, though unlit, still held traces of recent use, ashes fresh but faint, barely concealing something that had been burned away. Holmes moved without instruction, crossing the room as if drawn toward something unseen. His hands hovered over the desk, his fingers brushing lightly over the scattered pages. Then he turned toward the mirror. The large, ornate mirror above the fireplace had been shattered, the cracks forming a web across its surface. Shards of glass littered the floor beneath it, the largest fragment still clinging to the frame. Holmes crouched, picking up a single piece between his fingers, tilting it toward the dim light. The break was not from impact. It had not been struck by an object, nor had it fallen from its place. The pattern of the cracks suggested something else, something far stranger. The fractures originated not from the edges but from the center, as if something had forced its way outward. Holmes remained silent as he studied it, his mind working through the possible explanations. A mirror could shatter under pressure, under heat, under stress, but there was no sign of any of these causes. There was only the eerie pattern, the way the cracks spiraled outward unnaturally like veins spreading from an unseen source. Victor exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. He demanded to know what Holmes was looking for, what he expected to find. Holmes ignored him. His attention was drawn elsewhere. The floor, near the edge of the desk, just beneath the chair where Alistair had last been seen, lay a single footprint burned into the wood. Holmes knelt beside it, running his gloved fingers along the edge of the charred surface. The print was precise, distinct, as though seared into the flooring by intense heat. But there was no trace of fire, no candle wax, no source of ignition nearby. The shape was human, unmistakably so, yet something about it felt wrong. The imprint was too deep, too defined, as though whoever had stood there had not simply walked across the floor but had been rooted to it, pressed down by something far heavier than their own weight. Holmes rose slowly, his mind assembling the pieces, though the full picture remained just beyond his grasp. He glanced toward the papers scattered across the desk, stepping closer to examine them. Among the ordinary documents, business ledgers, correspondence, financial reports, one stood out. A single sheet torn from a book, its edges uneven as if ripped in haste. A passage had been underlined in red ink. Holmes read the words carefully, his eyes narrowing. The world we know is merely a shadow of the one we do not. Watson, standing beside him, shifted uneasily. The room felt heavier now, as if the very air had thickened around them. Holmes did not believe in the supernatural, nor did he entertain ideas of realms beyond the physical. But he did believe in fear. And the man who had underlined these words, Alistair Harrington, had been afraid. Victor grew impatient, his voice edged with frustration. He wanted answers, demanded an explanation. Holmes turned toward him, his expression unreadable. He told Victor that Alistair had not been taken by force, nor had he left willingly. Something had drawn him away from this room, something that had reached for him not from outside the house but from within it. Victor's face darkened, his jaw tightening. He refused to accept the implication. His brother was not the kind of man who entertained madness, who succumbed to illusions. But Holmes knew better. He had seen the way fear manifested itself, how it wormed its way into a person's mind long before it consumed them. Alistair had been slipping into paranoia, seeing things others could not. And then, one night, he had simply vanished. Holmes turned back toward the mirror, staring at his own reflection fractured through the broken glass. He did not believe in ghosts, but he believed in logic. And logic told him that this case was unlike any other he had encountered before. Something had been here, something had left its mark, and Sherlock Holmes was going to find it. Sherlock Holmes stepped away from the shattered mirror, his reflection now fragmented into dozens of distorted pieces. His mind worked in precise calculations, piecing together the elements of this case that refused to align. He did not allow superstition to taint his reasoning, yet the evidence before him defied conventional logic. A mirror broken from within, a footprint burned into the wooden floor, a man who had disappeared from a locked room without a trace. None of these were tricks of perception. Each was a tangible fact, and facts, no matter how impossible they seemed, always led to an explanation. He turned back to the desk, his fingers brushing over the scattered papers, feeling the texture of the torn page beneath his fingertips. He lifted it again, rereading the underlined passage. The world we know is merely a shadow of the one we do not. Alistair Harrington had been trying to warn himself. But of what? Holmes knew that messages left behind by those who disappeared were never meaningless. They were desperate attempts to be understood, to be found. He moved to the bookshelves that lined the study, his fingers running along the spines searching for anything that seemed out of place. The books were arranged meticulously, but one section bore signs of disturbance. The dust had been disturbed. Certain books had been handled more frequently than others. He pulled one free, opening it to the title page. It was a study on the nature of perception, exploring the idea that the mind could be trained to see beyond the limitations of physical reality. Holmes had no patience for philosophy, but he recognized when a man was searching for something beyond what science had explained. Victor stood near the door, his arms crossed tightly, watching Holmes with growing impatience. He had not interrupted, but his expression had hardened into something unreadable. Holmes did not need to look at him to know the man was close to losing control of his emotions. A man like Victor Harrington was not accustomed to the unknown, to problems that could not be solved with money or force. He had built his empire on certainty, on power, on being the one to dictate outcomes. And yet here he was, reduced to waiting in his own home, watching another man dismantle the last place his brother had been seen. Holmes ignored him and moved to the fireplace, crouching down to examine the ashes more closely. He reached into the cold embers, sifting through them carefully, until his fingers found something that did not belong. He pulled it free, a small, partially burned scrap of parchment, its edges blackened. The ink was faded, but a few words remained legible. They were handwritten, hurried, as if scrawled in fear. He tilted the fragment toward the dim light, reading what little was left. Not alone, watching, knows I see. Holmes held the parchment between his fingers, turning it over in his mind. Alistair had not simply disappeared. He had been expecting something, watching for something. And most importantly, he had left this message in a rush, meaning he had known, in his final moments within this room, that whatever had come for him was already inside. Watson shifted beside him, uneasy. Holmes could feel his friend's discomfort in the way he hovered, his presence heavier than usual. He had seen Watson walk into battle with steady hands, had seen him treat the gravely wounded without a tremor. But this case was different. This was not a matter of murder, of theft, of human deception. This was something that did not fit neatly into categories. Watson did not like the unknown, and neither did Holmes. But unlike Watson, Holmes thrived in it. He stood abruptly, pocketing the scrap of parchment, and turned back toward the door. The answers were no longer here. The study had been the scene of Alistair's final moments, but not the place where he had vanished. Whatever had happened, it had not happened in isolation. Holmes knew patterns, and patterns told him that this had not been a single event. If Alistair had believed he was being followed, then the truth did not lie in this room. It lay in the places he had been before this night. He instructed Victor to tell him exactly where Alistair had gone in the days leading up to his disappearance. Victor hesitated, clearly reluctant to admit something. Holmes did not wait for an answer. He moved past him, stepping into the corridor, his sharp gaze scanning the long stretch of hallway. The servants had been questioned. The security had seen nothing. But Holmes knew better than to take people at their word. He walked without pause, his feet moving as if drawn by instinct. He reached the end of the corridor and paused outside another door. It was smaller, less grand than the study, but it bore signs of recent use. He pressed his hand against it, feeling the slightest give in the frame, a looseness that suggested it had been opened in haste, perhaps forced shut too quickly. He turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was dark, the air heavier here, carrying the scent of something faintly metallic. He reached for a match, striking it against the wall, the flame casting flickering light into the space. His eyes moved swiftly, cataloging every detail. A narrow cot, blankets disheveled, an oil lamp on the bedside table, a servant's quarters. And yet, it was not the room of any ordinary servant. There were papers tucked beneath the mattress, a small trunk at the foot of the bed left unlocked. Holmes lifted the lid, his fingers brushing over the contents. Not clothing, not personal belongings, but journals. Dozens of them, each filled, with notes written in an unfamiliar hand. He pulled one free, flipping through the pages, his mind latching onto the repetition of certain phrases. He sees me. I cannot sleep. The mirrors are wrong. It moves when I am not looking. Holmes closed the book with a quiet snap. Someone else in this house had known. Someone else had seen what Alistair had seen. He turned toward Victor, who had followed him inside, his face pale now, the arrogance drained from his expression. Holmes told him that Alistair had not been the only one in this house who had felt something watching him. This journal belonged to a servant, someone who had either fled or had been removed. Victor's expression darkened. He admitted, after a long pause, that a housekeeper had left suddenly 2 weeks prior. She had been with the family for years, yet had abandoned her post without warning. No letter, no explanation. Holmes felt a shift in the air. The answer was closing in. This case had never been about one man. It was about something much larger, something that had been lurking beneath the surface for longer than anyone had realized. He stepped toward the mirror in the corner of the room, its surface clean, unbroken. He lifted his hand and pressed his fingertips against the glass. A sensation crawled up his spine, an awareness, a fleeting impression of something not quite right. He had never believed in the impossible, but for the first time in his life, Sherlock Holmes began to wonder if he was looking for a man who had not simply disappeared. He was looking for a man who had stepped somewhere no one was meant to go. Sherlock. Holmes stood before the mirror, his fingers pressing lightly against its cold, smooth surface. His mind, trained to dismiss illusions and filter reality through the lens of logic, hesitated for the briefest moment. The glass should have reflected nothing more than his own image. The dim glow of the oil lamp behind him, the towering frame, of Victor Harrington standing tense near the door, and Watson's carefully measured expression. And yet something about this reflection felt wrong. It was not an absence of detail, nor an excess of it. It was something far worse, something just slightly misaligned. A fraction of a second too slow, a barely perceptible shift in perspective, as though the reflection was not merely mirroring reality but observing it. He withdrew his hand, stepping back just enough to take in the full view of the room. The servants' quarters, though small, bore the unmistakable weight of fear. The bed left in disarray spoke of restless nights. The journal entries, frantic and repetitive, revealed a mind unraveling under the pressure of something unseen. A housekeeper who had vanished without a trace, a brother who had been speaking to mirrors before he disappeared, and a house filled with the remnants of paranoia. This was not a case of murder, nor was it a case of abduction. This was something else entirely. He turned toward Victor, who had remained silent, his usually composed features now strained. Holmes knew what the man wanted. He wanted assurance, an explanation that fit within the boundaries of reason. He wanted to be told that his brother had been taken by some rival, that there was an enemy he could strike down, a price he could pay to bring Alistair back. But Holmes could offer him none of these things. He moved back toward the desk in the study, where the torn fragment of parchment still lay untouched. He lifted it again, running his fingers along the burned edges, feeling the way the paper had crumbled slightly under heat. Though there had been no fire in this room, the ink, now faded, had been written with a hand that shook. Not alone. Watching. Knows I see. Holmes stepped to the broken mirror once more, crouching beside the fractured shards that still clung to the floor. He picked up the largest piece, turning it carefully in his palm, tilting it under the light. The crack at the center of the mirror spread outward like veins, splitting the reflection into unnatural fragments. The pattern was deliberate, controlled, unlike a typical shatter caused by force. Then, slowly, he moved the shard to face Victor. The businessman flinched, his gaze flickering to the reflection of himself before shifting away. Holmes saw it then, the way Victor's throat tightened, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. This was not the first time Victor had looked into a mirror and questioned what he saw staring back at him. Holmes placed the shard down without a word. He turned toward the doorway, stepping out into the corridor, feeling the weight of the house settle around him. The silence stretched, thick and unmoving, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the fear that had lingered here for weeks. He moved through the halls, retracing the path Alistair had taken in his final days. The staff had seen nothing. The security had no records of intrusions. But Holmes knew that fear did not grow in isolation. If Alistair had been haunted by something, if the housekeeper had fled from something, then it had not begun in one night. It had been building, creeping its way through the halls like a shadow that no one dared to acknowledge. He reached Alistair's bedroom, untouched since the morning he had vanished. He stepped inside, scanning the space with precise efficiency. The bed was neatly made, the wardrobe closed, the windows locked from the inside. He moved toward the writing desk, his fingers tracing the edge, noting the faint indentations left behind by a restless hand. He opened the drawer, finding only a single sheet of paper left inside. It was blank, save for a small, smeared fingerprint at the bottom corner, as though someone had gripped it tightly before letting it go. Then, without warning, the air shifted. Holmes stilled, his sharp mind recognizing the sensation before he could fully explain it. The temperature had dropped, not by degrees, not gradually, but all at once, as though the warmth had been pulled from the room in a single breath. He did not turn immediately. He had learned over years of studying human behavior that the mind often perceived things before the body reacted. The trick was in allowing the perception to settle before acknowledging it. Watson stepped into the room behind him, his footfalls unnaturally loud against the silence. Holmes did not speak. He only lifted his gaze slightly, just enough to catch the reflection in the glass of the wardrobe. Something moved, not his own reflection, not Watson's. Something else standing just behind them. Holmes turned sharply, but the space was empty. The air remained heavy, charged with the kind of stillness that did not belong in a house without life. He did not allow himself to hesitate. He stepped forward, his mind already categorizing the sensation, breaking it down into logical components. He knew that fear could manipulate perception, that the mind could betray itself under the right conditions. But he also knew that Alistair had stood in this very room and seen something that had been enough to drive him to madness. He turned toward Victor, who had remained in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Holmes did not need to ask him what he had seen. The man's silence spoke louder than any confession could. Then, without warning, the mirror in the far corner cracked. The sound was sharp, sudden, splintering through the room like the snapping of bone. The glass did not shatter completely, but a single deep fissure ran from top to bottom, cutting through the reflection. Holmes moved toward it immediately, his breath steady, his heartbeat even. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the glass. For a moment nothing happened. Then the surface beneath his touch grew cold, far colder than the air around them. Watson stepped forward, his concern evident, but Holmes did not move. He let his fingers linger against the glass, let his own reflection stare back at him. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the reflection changed. Not his features, not his stance, but the eyes. The reflection of Sherlock Holmes did not blink. He withdrew his hand instantly, stepping back. The moment passed, the glass settling once more into its fractured state. The room remained unchanged, but Holmes knew that something had just shifted. He turned away, his mind already reaching conclusions he did not yet wish to name. This was no longer a case of a missing man. This was a case of something reaching through the spaces between reality, something that Alistair had seen and had been taken by. He moved past Victor without another word, heading toward the staircase. There was nothing more to be gained from the study, from the bedroom, from the remnants of Alistair's final moments in this house. The answers were not here. They were somewhere else, somewhere Holmes had yet to look. Victor called after him, demanding to know what was happening, what he had seen. Holmes did not stop. He only told him that Alistair had not simply vanished. He had found something that was never meant to be found, and whatever it was, it had been watching all along.